Today's talk is entitled Promise and Problems in Social Media to be delivered by Allison Hayward. Allison trained as an attorney, served as the head of case selection for the Facebook Oversight Board from August 20 to March 23. She previously held governmental positions as a commissioner on the California Fair Political Practices Commission and as co-chair and member of the Board of Office of Congressional Ethics. A native of Las Vegas, Nevada, she first visited Cambria in 1989 and has lived here mostly since 2003. She is married and a mom, I love this, to two putative adults. Allison, would you please come forward? Thank you.
Maybe others can relate. Well, thank you very much for having me this morning. I know the two readings I chose are a bit challenging, but hopefully I can wrap them together and we can come to some sort of interesting understanding by the end of my talk. So, social media, you may be using even though you don't use Facebook or X or Instagram. Certainly Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, X, formerly known as Twitter, are the ones that you think about. Reddit, maybe, Threads. But how about Etsy, Amazon, Discord, Uber, Google Maps? These social media platforms have immense reach globally. They have billions of users, hundreds of billions of pieces of content, of memes, photos, comments, reviews, whatever. And the reason I talk about social media in a broader term that includes things like Etsy, Amazon, and Uber is that all these platforms share a new challenge in publication that we didn't really have before, which is how to manage user-generated content that comes published quickly without really control of the platform. That would be a review of an Uber driver, a review of an Amazon purchase, a post or comment on Facebook is typically what people think of, but it's not limited to that. And the challenges are similar throughout those different platforms. There's a need to moderate in over 130 languages. Because why? Can't you just let things go? No, you can't. First of all, some content is criminal. That is, the platform cannot have on it aiding and abetting of terrorism, for example. That's a federal crime. Child sexual assault material, you cannot possess it. It's a federal crime. There has to be some minimal, at best, moderation of those billions and billions of pieces of content flowing into whatever platform it is constantly. Then the platforms will have, of course, a market and want discretion to be able to edit other things. Platform may feel strongly about violent content or sexually explicit content or bullying and hate speech. Personal threats typically go down because of, again, the danger in the real world that somebody might be harmed. Health information has been controversial, as I'm sure you know. Animal cruelty, all kinds of reasons why a platform as a customer service task would not want those pieces of content there. And certainly the advertisers, who are very important to the platform because it's what pays the bills, do not want their advertisements adjacent to such content. And critically, I mean, not only is there a new challenge in this user-generated content coming to the platform without any sort of editorial judgment, it has to be done very quickly. I mean, it just takes a minute or two of something originally being up for it to spread like wildfire. So this has to be done very fast. Now, some of you may have a background in management or consulting or some other sort of business endeavor, and you might be familiar with the expression that's known as the iron triangle. You can have it good, you can have it cheap, or you can have it fast. Pick two. Now, with content moderation, it has to be fast. We've already talked about why that is. So it can either be cheap or it can be good, but it has to be fast. And so you either have a cheap, low quality job or an expensive and decent job. And because it's not a revenue source for the platforms, and platforms tend to want to do it on the cheap. which means automation, which means a lot of engineering work on the back end, and a minimal amount of reconsideration on the front end. Human beings are expensive. Once you've got the software written, it's pretty cheap. As the first reading discussed in 2016, Facebook's posture was grow, just grow. We connect people. This is our impetus to grow. It expands globally, sure, but it also decides to have a universal content moderation standard for these things like hate speech and bullying and violence and harassment. And that gets hard in 130 languages to evaluate whether or not, in context, that expression in Oromo is hate speech or bullying, or is it a statement of some sort of spiritual, religious, or cultural affinity that Facebook would, if it knew the context, would want to keep on the platform. It gets very difficult. How many moderators are there who speak Estonian or Oromo or Tigray, who don't themselves have a bias? So after several controversies related to 2016, Facebook decided to form something called the Oversight Board. That's where I worked. And the first reading hints at why. They were agnostic to the impact that they were having, or some people were, but there was a lot of pressure from the outside to take down bad stuff that was harming people in Myanmar, harming people in Eastern Europe, harming people in sub-Saharan Africa, like really harming people, like, you know, people were dying as a result of things that were being said on the platform. This is not good. They didn't want this. So, but they wanted somebody else to decide what exactly the standards ought to be, because it's difficult to do that. And so they formed the Oversight Board with international human rights experts. Their standard is going to be content moderation that aligned with international human rights. The board was going to be independent, global reach again, and again, the thing that Facebook insists on is global standards. Okay, so international human rights experts, as well as free speech experts and other sorts of content moderation experts, were put on this board. It was staffed up with people like me in 2020. And so what did I do? I hired a international team of 8 people, and we would get the appeals that would come through Facebook when Facebook had taken action on a piece of content to take it down, or when a user had asked them to take something down and they refused. They would then be able to appeal to us, and we would get to look at the piece of content. If somebody had asked for it to be taken down and was left up, we'd get their case for why, which it was awful. And we would review this queue of information. Given the language and cultural problems that I've alluded to, I was confronted with the issue of, can you find somebody who speaks Oromo who would be a good content moderator? I did. And Robert is still with the board, and he's a great guy. Anyway, Spanish is obviously a language that we needed to have mastery in. Chinese, and my Chinese speaker was also somebody who was very interested in learning other similar character-driven languages. I know there's a better word for that. I just don't remember what it is right now. And so he was very helpful. I had a lady with a South Asian background who knew some Urdu and some Hindi. And so we were trying to, this little team of 8 is trying to do what Facebook was not doing very well, which is understand the messages in context to figure out whether they were appropriately on the platform or not. And we were not helped by the fact that, remember, it has to be, it's going to be either cheap, or it's going to be poor. It's going to be cheap and poor, or it's going to be expensive and good. One of the things that's very expensive in this process is good professional translations. And so we weren't getting those. So of the languages that we did not master, we were getting stuff that looks a little bit like Google Translate. You can kind of get the gist of what's happening, but if you're looking for nuance, no. So I was at the oversight board for a little over 2.5 years, working remotely on Zoom, sorry. And looking back, the oversight board has had a while to work with the platform that put it together. Has it helped? I think it has, but I think one of the things that seemed to be a strength when the oversight board was being put together that's turned out to be a weakness is the emphasis on applying international human rights norms to content moderation. It's not that they're bad, they're very instructive at sort of a meta level, but an international human rights informed judgment is very hard to scale for the rest of the platform. When you say this person's content about this local dispute is not hate speech in the context because the local dispute is sufficiently newsworthy that it should remain on the platform. Say that's the oversight board's response to a piece of content that's before it. How do you scale that? There's no objective like measure to say what's newsworthy and what isn't. But yet that's a kind of result that you would get from the oversight board, which did not lead to realistic standards that would actually change what was happening on the platform overall. The other thing is what we could just hear a vanishingly small percentage of cases. We were talking about billions of pieces of content, 300 million a minute, or I mean, it's a really strange, big number, the kind of things that astrophysicists understand and the rest of us don't. And we would be able to render opinions in maybe 15 or 20 a year. So that was the oversight board's and Facebook's response by forming the oversight board to the complaint that it was doing an insufficient job of taking down really damaging information. Meanwhile, in the United States, again, the notion that there's a global problem here is actually there's a rather sectarian problem, because in the US, we've got political activists who are saying, wait a second, you Silicon Valley people, you're taking down too much content. I'm being censored. I think you probably understand the gist of who might be making those complaints, but nevertheless, deplatforming of American political leaders and activists were a subject of complaint that got a lot of traction. And that's where the second reading today comes in. American states wanted to prevent platforms from censoring, and so wanted to tell platforms how to do content moderation so that they wouldn't censor. And so that second reading is a summary. It's not the actual verbiage from the court, it's from the syllabus. But it's where the court confirmed that the content decisions that these platforms are making are protected by the First Amendment. The government doesn't get to tell them to even the playing field or choose this winner or this loser. They rejected a common carrier idea. That was one that was being presented by the states, which just says basically, no, really these platforms, you should think of them as a phone company or as some other kind of common carrier, which is a legal term that basically means that you are serving the public and there are limits on how much you can pick and choose who you serve. The train takes all well-behaving passengers and doesn't tell Democrats that they have to get off the train. The phone company, your cell service, won't deny you service because of your political views or your religion or whatever, common carrier stuff, where ordinarily private entities with some restrictions can pick and choose who they work with. There's civil rights laws, there are a gloss on that. We're not going to get into that, but I'm saying so overall, a private person, I can censor who speaks in my home. You can censor who speaks here. You're not a common carrier. Notwithstanding the fact that when you think about that first reading again, there's somebody internal to Facebook saying, we kind of are. All we do is connect people. So I want to present to you the arc of how much has happened since 2016. How's the platform think of itself? What are people mad at the platform about? Is it taking down information or is it keeping information up? So moving forward, I think what I see are different platforms for different tasks. I think the notion that Facebook or Instagram or YouTube is a new common square is wrong. I think they're corners of a larger common square. I know personally, I use Facebook for keeping track of friends and particularly like local Cambria stuff, because there's a lot of local Cambria stuff on Facebook. I use Instagram for keeping track of entertainers I know. I use X as sort of a news aggregate, because notwithstanding the fact there's a lot of crazy stuff on X, I think for me, it's pretty useful that way. There's no one solution for everything I want. Boz at Facebook in 2016 was wrong. They can't do everything. They cannot do all the connection for everyone. And then finally, I just want to plant the idea that, you know, social media has done a lot of good for a lot of people. It's free. I mean, you have to pay with your eyeballs and look at advertising, but that's like free television. You have to do that too. You know, access to friends, customers, newsmakers. I don't have a Christmas card list like my mom did because I don't need one. I can keep track of my high school friends on Facebook. It allows people to engage and learn, as our fourth principle we've talked about states, and there are trade-offs. And I've told you about some of those today and my experience with the Oversight Board, and I thank you for listening.
Take some questions.
Yeah.
We have extra time.
Yeah, I can take a question. Feedback.
I'm sure we have something, right?
Hi, Ted.
We have time for questions if you have any.
Yeah.
Well, after watching the film The Social Dilemma, you know, the business of tracking people's clicks, tracking, you know, people's preferences, you know, why did that ad come up when I was just looking at an advertisement? So did that figure into any of the deliberations that you were involved with?
The short technical answer is no, that was out of scope. But in many of the decisions of the Oversight Board, the board would poke back at Facebook about that kind of stuff, particularly as it relates to taking people who are already inclined to extremism and feeding them more extremist stuff.
Right.
Those sort of preferential algorithms are poorly understood even by the people who own them. They do weird, unexpected things. Well, I think we'll see as we start playing more with, you know, deep machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think we're just going to see more weird. And ultimately, I think content moderation is an aspect of customer service. And if it gets too dopey, they'll stop doing it because they'll lose customers. Yes.
Could AI help with some of these issues now? Certainly with the translations and stuff like that, wouldn't we be
Yes.
much more effective?
Yes. Again, you know, more expensive than what we have, but certainly once you build it, it's not that expensive to run. And I think I assume that that's what they're doing, because content moderation mistakes do have a cost as well. They annoy people, they make for bad publicity, they lead to things like, you know, an internal interest in having something like an oversight board, which itself is not cheap. Yes, I think I would like to see how well AI can be trained to do translations. I still think there's something about human beings that catch nuance in a way that will be very, very hard to train an algorithm or a program to do. I mean, there's this whole other level of, I mean, I don't know that you could teach AI to even spot sarcasm, which is really hard.
No, it's not.
Well done. Yes, sir.
Do you have any other specific personal suggestions as to solutions?
Personal suggestions. Yeah, I think if I were queen of a platform, and this, I'm speaking to Unitarians, and so this might be a little off script, but I think the notion that there can be a global standard is really naive. I think that there are some societies like the US and Canada and Western Europe where a very similar standard might apply. But I think when you start talking about global standards for hate speech related to trans and homosexual people, and you start applying that in Oman, it's hard. And it's not because those people are bad people, it's because we talk about things differently. And what's acceptable to talk about in public is very different. And you need to be sensitive to that. And so I think if I were queen of a global platform, I would be sympathetic to that and be very much more driven, sort of like Reddit is. Reddit's content moderation comes from the users. You administer your little subreddit, and within reason, it's kind of yours. You can't have any of the illegal stuff that we talked about. But to the extent that you want people to be able to use profanity, it's your subreddit. People don't like that, they'll leave your subreddit. Subreddits are these little sort of groups within the larger Reddit umbrella. So you might have a subreddit about Cambria, or a subreddit about pawns, or a subreddit about crochet, or a subreddit about, right-wing nationalism. And the administrators basically govern their little fiefdoms. They've sort of left it to, now, certainly that makes it easier for people with extremist views to find the little subreddit, but that subreddit's views aren't necessarily being like flung out beyond that. And if you admit for a minute that there are going to be people with extremist views, and the task is not to eradicate them, perhaps it is to educate them, then your real concern is that spreading, which, as Ted mentioned before, some of the algorithms have been known to do, but in a system like what Reddit has, it's a much less likely thing.